Guys, BG back with another video on Brook versus Golovkin. Did a video only last week on this fight, and I'm probably going to do several next week as well. Certainly the podcast and the live show, I'm sure, will focus around this fight. So I don't want to go into too much overkill on it. But at the same time, news keeps developing. And in this video, I want to discuss two particular breaking bits of news relating to the fight. Latterly, we'll come on to the 7-day Czech weigh-in that has sparked some interest amongst the boxing fans. But before we do, I'm going to talk about the WBA and WBA's decision not to sanction this fight and not to allow their middleweight belt to be on the line here. At first, when I heard this news, my initial reaction was that this was a good thing. I actually initially wanted to come out and applaud the WBA and say, good for doing something different, good for standing up for what is right in boxing. As I say, this was my initial instinct, and that has changed, over the course of the last day or so. But I guess initially I kind of felt, what has Kell Brook actually done to merit fighting for this championship? I understand Kell Brook's a big name. I understand Kell Brook is an undefeated fighter who's a world champion in his own right. But the fact he's a world champion at 147 should largely be irrelevant to his ranking and his ability to get a world title at 160. There are other guys at 160 who you would assume would be chosen before him. So my initial gut instinct was that this was actually a good thing from the WBA. And the WBA came out and said that the reason they'd come to this decision was because of the health of Kell Brook and because they feared that a fight like this could be detrimental to the health of Kell Brook. Presumably they felt that stepping up 2 weight classes to fight the number 1 guy in the middleweight division without having had a prep fight whatsoever is not something they're happy to condone and could lead to unnecessary risk on behalf of Kell Brook. All of which I agree with. But as I've got into it, I think I've had 3 thoughts developing, which has kind of made me think that this was actually a bit silly from the WBA. Number 1, whilst they have raised a concern about Kell Brook's health, let's be honest, their decision not to sanction the fight with a week to go was clearly never going to actually affect the fight happening. So as a result, one has to question whether they made this decision actually in the best interest of Kell's health. I mean, if, for example, their decision could stop the fight happening, you'd have to say, okay, fair, they're standing up for what they believe in. But realistically, this decision is not going to affect whether the fight goes ahead or not. So, I guess the question on my mind is their excuse about this being for Kell Brook's health actually valid when there's no suggestion that this decision can have any impact on the fight taking place, and therefore no suggestion that this fight can have any impact on Kell Brook's health? I guess that was the thought number 1 that went through my head. The thought number 2 that went through my head is, as much as I don't like the fight happening, if Kell Brook goes and beats Gennady Golovkin, how do we not class him as the middleweight champion? Isn't it a bizarre situation that Kell could beat Golovkin and that the WBA belt could become vacant? You know, I'd prefer to see Golovkin fight a middleweight, if I'm honest. Having said that, if Brook goes and does the business, Golovkin is by far and away the number 1 in that division. So if Brook goes and does the business, it would be rather unfair for him not to win that belt and for the belt to become vacant. For me, that really doesn't add up, and that's just going to lead to an unnecessary situation if Kell Brook was able to pull the upset. Now, I don't expect that to happen because, as you guys know, I expect Golovkin to win the fight. But I think that is one strange consequence here of their decision not to sanction this fight. Now, the other thing I wanted to think about is the WBA are taking a stance here and trying to obviously separate themselves from the other governing bodies and trying to show how seriously they take boxing as a business by making this decision. But wasn't it only last week that the WBA president was quoted as saying he would really, really like David Haye to be the WBA champion again? And there was some discussions about David Haye getting a title shot against Lucas Brown or against Fraser Quendo, for the WBA regular belt. Now, for me, a governing body should not come out and say that they would like any fighter to be their champion. They shouldn't have a chosen fighter. They shouldn't have a fighter they'd prefer to win. Of course, we all know behind closed doors that they do. But politically, it seems strange to come and announce that they'd like David Haye to be their world champion. You'd think they'd want the best fighter to be their world champion. You'd think they'd want whoever is the worthy winner of the fight to be their world champion. Now, of course, I'm not stupid. If David Haye fights Fresequendo, it's far better for the publicity of the belt, and it's far better for the sanctioning fees if David Haye was to emerge victorious. But surely, if you want to come across as a well-meaning governing body, aren't you more inclined, surely you've got to take the line that if Fresequendo beats David Haye, then you want him to be the world champion. It seemed like a strange comment for me to make. And let's be honest, the WBA is a bizarre organisation. I mean, just look at the heavyweights. You've got the super champion, the regular champion, the interim champion. You've got guys like Guillermo Jones, the cruiserweight, and Trevor Byron in the top 15 rankings. It's a bizarre system. So how they're deciding to take the high ground here, and how they're deciding to make a statement by not sanctioning this fight, for me seems very, very, very bizarre. As I say, my gut instinct initially was good. It's good that this fight is not being sanctioned. But as I've got into it, is their excuse about Brook's health valid? Well, maybe they don't want to associate themselves with it, but let's be honest, the fight's going to continue regardless. Is it fair that Brook could beat Golovkin, who's definitely the #1 middleweight, and not win that title? No, that doesn't seem fair to me either. If the fight's being made, Kell Brook should have the opportunity to win the title if he does remain victorious, Perhaps if they had come out 2 months earlier and said they'd strip Golovkin if he took a fight against a non-middleweight, I'd give them respect for doing that. But a week before the fight, it just seems bizarre. And to me, it seems like a publicity attempt. It seems like an attempt to raise their profile because they know that it's not going to stop the fight from happening. And it's just a way of maybe grabbing some attention in the lead up to such a big fight and getting their name as taking the moral high ground in the newspapers and boxing publications, I guess. So it seems really, really bizarre to me, having reflected on it. And yeah, I think the WBA is a bizarre organisation in terms of some of their practices. And I think that this was, as I say, an attention-seeking moment, really. That's what I put it down to. Let's change the pace and let's talk about these check weigh-ins. So Kell Brook weighed in at 168 or 167 and a bit. He weighed in nearly at 168, which for you guys, as you will know, is pretty much on the super middleweight limit. So you've got Kell Brook, the welterweight world champion, 7 days before a fight, weighing in as a big super middleweight. Now Golovkin's weighed in at 162. It was maybe 162 and a bit, but it was certainly less than 163. And obviously the internet's gone mental. Twitter's gone mental. Facebook's gone mental. People are saying Kell Brook is huge. People are saying, what's going on with the weight? Now again, this is a subject matter where I had an initial reaction, and having reflected on it, I've come up with a second opinion. My initial reaction is, wow, what is Kell Brook doing? Why is he still so heavy? Because that's the kind of narrative that Eddie Hearn and Sky and Matchroom are trying to spin, is what a monster Kell Brook is at this weight and what an improvement we're going to see. And yeah, it perhaps doesn't, it's perhaps somewhat of a surprise that Kell Brook would be 5 pounds higher 7 days before the fight than the reigning middleweight champion. But actually, now I've reflected on it, I think this is a bit of a non-story. It's fairly routine for boxers at the world title level to be 7 or 8 pounds above weight with a week to go. That's not at all uncommon. In fact, I would actually say that the Golovkin is the odd one out here rather than Kell Brook. It's actually really uncommon for a fighter to be only 2 pounds over the weight 7 days out, in my experience. Now, there'll be people out there who are far more experienced than me, and there'll be trainers out there who know a lot more about the weight cutting process than me. But 2 pounds overweight the week before of a fight suggests to me that you're making the weight very, very easily. I've long said on this channel Golovkin could make light middleweight. I've long said that Golovkin is a very, very small middleweight. And for me, this is further evidence of that. I'm actually not buying into this, that Kell Brook's 167 or 168 pounds. I'm not buying into it as evidence of how big or what a beast Kell Brook is. Because I actually think it's fairly standard. I think what he's doing here is regular. And I think that Golovkin only being £2 over the weight limit is the odd one out. You know, look at Kell Brook. Kell Brook is not a big middleweight. Let's not get sucked into this hype. Kell Brook, he's a decent sized welterweight. As I said in my myths video last week, is he noticeably bigger than Keith Thurman? Is he noticeably bigger than Errol Spence? I'm not so sure. He's a very good sized welterweight, but I believe he'd be small at light middleweight. And you know, if anyone wants proof of how small he is at middleweight, look at the photo on Tommy Langford's Facebook of Tommy Langford sparring with Kell. You know, for me, Langford does look a weight class, if not 2 weight classes bigger than him. Certainly, if you think of other guys, even light middleweights like Demetrius Andrade, you'd expect he'd be towering over Kell Brook. And yeah, let's not get sucked into this hype of Kell Brook being some sort of middleweight beast. He's a good sized welterweight. I suspect he would be a small light middleweight, and I'm confident that he's a tiny middleweight. Golovkin is a very small middleweight in my opinion. He's a guy who could make light middleweight and be a decent sized light middleweight. So the gap in size isn't as vast as one would initially expect when you think of a welter fighting a middle. But nevertheless, the gap is still there as I'm concerned. And as I say, all of this internet reaction about Kell still being 167 or 168 pounds, I kind of think that's to be expected. I kind of think what Kell is doing is actually the standard in terms of making weight these days, still being 7 or 8 pounds over with a few days left to run. Whereas I think Golovkin is, you know, if anything, Golovkin is lighter than I'd expect. The thing is, like, rehydrating, now we've got weigh-ins the day before the fight, and we've had that for years, but now we've got weigh-ins the day before the fight. Rehydrating and putting on weight after the weigh-in is a key component of boxing. If you're a 160 pound fighter, you want to be coming into the ring at 170, because let's be honest, if you don't adopt that tactic, your opponent's going to have a weight advantage. You know, if you're a 160 fighter coming into the ring at 160, you're severely disadvantaged in modern day boxing. Now, we can debate the rights and wrongs of that in a separate video, but that's the fact. And you know, these days, in terms of preparing a boxer and getting a boxer ready for a big fight, that's as much part of the game as any other part of the game. So for me, let's say Golovkin is walking around this week at 162, and let's say he, I don't know, goes in a sauna and loses those 2 pounds and weighs in at 160. What's he going to come into the ring at? You know, he's going to put those 2 pounds back on from rehydration. He's going to have a few big meals the night before the fight, and he probably hasn't been having big meals in the past week. He's probably going to come in 165 to 168, that sort of bracket, which for me may not be a disadvantage against a guy like Kell Brook, but for me would be a massive disadvantage against a guy like Kushibank Jr., for example. Now, it may be that Golovkin is so advanced in terms of his boxing and power that a disadvantage of that nature is not in any way going to adversely affect his performance going into a big fight. And I suspect that may actually be the case. But nevertheless, if you do look at disadvantages, that would be one for me. So I guess the long and the short of it for me is that Golovkin's always been a small middleweight. And my perspective on these 7-day weigh-ins is actually it's Golovkin who's being the odd one out here rather than Kell. You know, Kell is not a middleweight. He doesn't have a middleweight frame. He doesn't have a middleweight skeleton. He doesn't have a middleweight bone structure. If he did, he wouldn't have been able to make 147 for so many years. What Kell has done is packed on muscle. He's packed on biceps. He's packed on leg muscles. You know, muscle weighs more than fat, as they say, is the old cliche. And he's been able to superficially put that weight on. But he's no middleweight. I'm not even 100% convinced he's a light middleweight. He's not got a frame. He's not got the bone structure, the range. And for me, let's not get too hyped up and too excited at the fact that Kell Brook's heavier. I think that's been their plan all along, and I just think Golovkin's a smaller guy at the weight. Let me know your thoughts on these 2 stories, guys. If you've enjoyed this, hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe so you can check out my other stuff. Many thanks for tuning in.